Hello? Yep. Okay.
Nothing's been touched. Everything's like I found it.
What's up?
Dad, he would have stood up by now.
All right, thank you, officer. This you were about to get into.
Dear. Better home than
For what?
this isn't a coronary. Dead on the ground. Knife and insurance policy involved, yeah? Yeah. And he must have screwed up a few times because there was multiple. Got a bucket here. Fucking vomit. Forensics waiting outside.
You didn't watch Se7en, you participated in it. Everyone who has ever seen this film remembers the ending, the desert, the box, Kevin Spacey's face calm as a confessor delivering his last line, Brad Pitt's gun hand trembling, Morgan Freeman sprinting across the field knowing what is about to happen and being powerless to stop it. You remember the moment Mills pulls the trigger. You remember the sick, cold feeling of watching John Doe get exactly what he wanted. But here's what you probably don't remember. For one fraction of a second, before the guilt set in, before the dread crystallized into meaning, you wanted him to do it. You wanted Mills to shoot. That desire, that flash of wrathful satisfaction, is the film you actually watched. Everything else, the gluttony victim drowning in his own pasta, the sloth victim rotting in his own bed, the pride victim carved into a suicide, all of it is prologue. All of it is preparation. John Doe didn't build a body count, he built an audience. And when the moment came, he needed that audience to feel one thing. Righteous anger so overwhelming that it could justify killing a man in cold blood, in front of witnesses, in broad daylight. He needed your wrath. He got it. Here's what everyone gets wrong about Se7en. Conventional reading. The reading that has dominated film criticism, YouTube essays, and college syllabi for 30 years frames this as a story about evil defeating good. A brilliant, twisted killer uses the 7 deadly sins as a blueprint for murder, outmaneuvers 2 detectives, and wins by engineering his own death at the hands of the man he has destroyed. It's a nihilistic film, critics said, a bleak statement about a fallen world. Some interpreted it as profound. Others found it gratuitous. Roger Ebert praised it and felt vaguely dirty afterward. Gene Siskel wanted something cleaner. The debate about Se7en has always been framed as, is this nihilism or does it have something meaningful to say? That debate misses the point entirely. Se7en is not nihilistic. It does not believe nothing matters. It believes with ferocious conviction in one specific moral argument, and it spends 2 hours and 7 minutes making you prove that argument correct. The film doesn't just observe human sinfulness, it engineers it in you. Right there in the theater, right there in your living room with your popcorn and your certainty that you're watching a crime thriller about other people's darkness. The film is a trap, and the trap is the thesis. Let's state it plainly, because it's the kind of claim that needs to be stated plainly before it can be defended. Se7en is not a detective film about a killer's 7 deadly sins. It is a conversion narrative, a theological seduction, in which John Doe performs 7 elaborate sermons designed to produce one specific sin in one specific person, the sin of wrath, in Detective David Mills, enacted before 2 witnesses, fulfilling Doe's complete theological vision. And the reason this matters, the reason this reading changes everything, is that Doe's sermon wasn't delivered only to Mills. It was delivered to you. You are the 8th congregant. You are the piece of the plan that Doe could not have designed, but could have predicted. Because he understood human nature better than any other character in the film, better perhaps than any character in American cinema of that decade. John Doe is not a villain who happens to be intelligent. He is a preacher who happens to commit crimes. The distinction is everything. Consider what a villain's plan looks like. A villain's plan is about the villain's benefit. Money, power, revenge, survival. John Doe's plan has none of those components. He gains nothing material. He doesn't escape. He doesn't intend to. He turns himself in at the midpoint of the film, covered in the blood of his 6th victim, calmly surrendering to police custody. A villain doesn't surrender from a position of power. A preacher does. A preacher walks into the lion's den because the lion's den is where the sermon needs to be delivered. Daniel walked into the den. Doe walked into the precinct. What does Doe want? He wants to force the world to confront its own sinfulness. He has said as much, explicitly, in the pages and pages of journals they find in his apartment. He doesn't want to escape. He doesn't want to be worshipped. He wants to be heard. He says it himself in the back of that police car with a patience that reads less as menace and more as exhausted evangelism. Wanting people to listen, you can't just tap them on the shoulder anymore. You have to hit them with a sledgehammer, and then you'll notice you've got their strict attention. That's not the logic of a murderer. That's the logic of a prophet. And here's the thing about prophets. The measure of a prophet's success is not whether the prophecy comes true. It's whether the audience changes. Doe's prophecy is this, that humans are capable of extraordinary sin when they believe their anger is righteous. That justified is the most dangerous word in the moral vocabulary. That wrath doesn't look like rage. It looks like justice. It feels like justice. It is justice until the moment you're standing in a field with a gun in your hand and a dead man's plan completed in your blood. For 30 years, critics have asked, did John Doe win? The answer is not yes. The answer is that the question proves he did. Here's what this essay will argue. Not comprehensively. I'm not here to cover every scene or trace every plot development. I'm here to make one claim and defend it until you can't find the edges of it anymore. The claim is, Se7en is a film about the sin of wrath, and the real sinner is not John Doe. Doe's sin is envy. He says so himself, and the film confirms it at every structural level. The sin of wrath belongs to Mills, and the sin of wrath belongs to you. To prove this, I'm going to look at 3 things. The conventional reading either ignores or misreads. First, who John Doe actually is, not psychologically, not forensically, but theologically and dramatically, because the film doesn't present him as insane. It presents him as consistent, as right in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. Second, how the film prepares its audience for the sin it wants to produce. Because Se7en's structure is not the structure of a detective story, it's the structure of a conversion experience, and the scenes everyone discusses as horror are actually functioning as moral instruction. Third, what the film's craft choices, the camera work, the score, the strategic withholding of images are actually doing to your moral faculties in real time. The stakes of this reading are not academic, they're urgent. We are living in 2026 in a world that John Doe would recognize. A world where anger is not just accepted but celebrated, where outrage is the dominant social currency, where the phrase justified wrath is used to rationalize acts that would have been recognized as monstrous in any previous era's moral vocabulary. Social media has become Doe's delivery mechanism, a system for staging moral atrocities, displaying them to mass audiences, and engineering the response. Righteous fury, the certainty that your rage is correct, the absolute conviction that the sin is theirs, not yours. Doe could not have designed Twitter, but he understood the human need that Twitter would eventually exploit. Se7en didn't predict the internet. It predicted the psychology that the internet would weaponize. That's not a small claim. It's the reason this film, 30 years later, is more important than it was in 1995, and why the comfortable nihilism interpretation has always been a way of avoiding what the film is actually pointing at. Nihilism is comfortable because it means the film is about other people, about a broken world, about a villain's darkness. The real interpretation is uncomfortable because it means the film is about you, about the rage you feel when innocence is destroyed, about the moment when your righteous anger and John Doe's righteous anger become structurally, philosophically, and morally the same thing. That's where we're going. Let's prove it. The monk's cell, the voluntary surrender, the sermon in the car. Before we talk about Doe's crimes, we need to talk about Doe's apartment, because the apartment tells you everything, if you're willing to look at what's actually there rather than what you're expecting to see. Most people who discuss John Doe's apartment focus on the notebooks. Thousands of pages of handwritten text, densely filled, the journals of what appears to be an obsessive, possibly delusional mind, spiraling through religious fixation toward violence. Critics cite the notebooks as evidence of madness. The sheer volume, something like 300 notebooks, according to Somerset's count, reads as pathological. No sane person fills 300 notebooks. But look at what's not in that apartment. There is no personal detritus, no photographs of family, no mementos, no evidence of a life interrupted by obsession. There is no mess of human existence. Dishes in the sink, laundry on the floor, comfort food wrappers, the ordinary archaeology of a person who was once normal and cracked. John Doe's apartment looks like what it is, a monastic cell, clean, spare, purposeful. The only objects present are objects in service of a mission. This is not the apartment of a man who lost his mind. This is the apartment of a man who, over years or decades, made a disciplined, deliberate decision about how he would live and what he would work toward. The 300 notebooks are not the evidence of breakdown. They are the evidence of commitment. They are a body of work, a theology, systematically developed, rigorously maintained. Somerset understands this. Look at his face when he reads the notebooks. He doesn't look like a detective encountering evidence of psychosis. He looks like a scholar encountering a rival argument. He looks disturbed, not because the writing is incoherent, but because it is coherent, because parts of it track with things he has thought himself in darker moments when the city has worn him down enough that Doe's logic feels less like madness and more like diagnosis. We'll get to Somerset's complicity later. For now, the point is the apartment. It establishes Doe not as a man consumed by mental illness, but as a man consumed by purpose. Those are not the same thing. The film knows the difference. Now, the surrender. This is the moment the conventional reading most catastrophically misreads. The standard interpretation of John Doe walking into police headquarters covered in blood, hands raised, is that he made a tactical error, that his plan required him to be caught at this stage, and so he arranged his capture. Some readings treat it as a power move, a demonstration of control. A few astute critics have noted that he surrenders at the midpoint of the film, which is structurally significant. But none of them have asked the right question. The right question is, why does a man who has successfully committed 6 elaborate, meticulously planned murders, who has left no forensic evidence, whose apartment the police only find because he allows them to find it, why does this man surrender to police custody when he is, by all measurable standards, winning? The answer is not tactical. The answer is theological. A preacher doesn't deliver a sermon from safety. A preacher delivers a sermon from the place of maximum exposure, maximum vulnerability, maximum witness. The Sermon on the Mount wasn't delivered from a fortress. It was delivered on a hillside, in public, surrounded by people who could turn hostile. Paul didn't write his letters from a comfortable study. He wrote them from prison. The surrender is the sermon. It is Doe placing himself in custody, in the hands of the very system he has been critiquing through his crimes, and saying, watch what happens next. Watch how this ends. Watch yourselves. His surrender is not a mistake or a tactical necessity. It's a performative act of theological showmanship. It's the moment a preacher walks to the front of the room and lays himself bare because the message requires a witness and a cost. And then, the car. The drive from police custody to the desert location is the scene everyone remembers for the wrong reasons. People quote Doe's lines about tapping on the shoulder and hitting with a sledgehammer as evidence of megalomania, as the villain monologuing. They're not wrong that Doe is speaking with conviction. They're wrong about what the conviction reveals. Listen to what Doe says in that car. Not the inflammatory bits, the structural argument. We see a deadly sin on every street corner in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common, it's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night. This is not the logic of a psychopath. This is the logic of a prophet confronting moral anesthesia. Doe is not wrong that the culture has normalized things that should disturb it. He is not wrong that people have become inured to suffering they should find intolerable. His methodology is monstrous. He will, in a few minutes, reveal that he has murdered an innocent pregnant woman, but his diagnosis has been validated across the entire film. The obese man didn't just die eating spaghetti. He was forced to eat until his stomach ruptured, and the film shows you his home, a rat-infested, filth-coated, consumption-saturated environment that was already killing him before Doe arrived. Victor, the sloth victim, had been living in a state of prolonged human decay for over a year, and the film reveals that he had a court-appointed lawyer who visited him 3 times and never noticed or reported his condition. Doe didn't create these people's sins. He revealed them, he exposed them, he brought them into the light. That's a preacher's job. What makes Doe chilling, genuinely philosophically chilling, rather than merely cinematically chilling, is that the film never actually refutes his argument. Somerset thinks he's wrong. Somerset's entire arc is built around believing that human decency is possible and worth defending. But the film doesn't give Somerset a moment where he proves Doe wrong. What it gives Somerset is a choice: keep fighting despite believing Doe might be partly right, or stop fighting and let Doe win by default. That's a profoundly different thing from showing Doe's worldview to be mistaken. A villain who is wrong is frightening. A preacher who might be partly right is terrifying. This proves the central argument: John Doe is functioning as a theological actor, not a criminal one. His crimes are sermons. His surrender is a performative act of conviction. His speech in the car is a theological argument delivered with the confidence of a man who knows he has already won, because the final piece of his sermon is about to be delivered and the congregation is already in the field. Victor, the lust scene, and Somerset's night in the library. There's a moment in Se7en that almost nobody talks about, and it is, I would argue, the most important scene in the film for understanding what Doe is actually doing. Not the gluttony murder, not the sloth victim, not the finale, the lust scene. What happens in the lust murder is this. A man is found dead wearing a custom-built bladed harness. He died, and this is important, killing someone else. The victim of lust is not the prostitute. The prostitute is murdered, yes, but she is Doe's staging, not Doe's point. The point is the man who was found at the scene, the man who was forced at gunpoint to wear the harness and commit the act that killed her. Doe forced an innocent man to become a murderer. This is not the same as punishing someone for their existing sin. Gluttony man was already glutting himself. Sloth, Victor, was already in a state of grotesque neglect. They were sinners being condemned. But the lust victim, the man with the harness, his sin was imposed. Doe manufactured his transgression, created it from the outside, forced it in. Why? What is the theological logic of creating a sinner rather than punishing one? The answer is the sermon's larger argument, that sin is not just about the choices of broken individuals. It is structural, environmental, that a world saturated in certain kinds of imagery and permission and normalized degradation produces sinners, whether those sinners were pre-inclined or not. Doe isn't saying punish people who choose to sin. Doe is saying, look at what the world produces. He manufactured that man's sin to demonstrate that any person under sufficient conditions will commit the thing that they believe themselves incapable of. The conventional reading calls this sadism. It is sadism. But it's also something else. It's the cruelest possible version of Doe's argument about human nature. And then he makes the same argument about Mills, not with a bladed harness, with a box. But we'll get to that. First, let's look at Victor, the sloth victim, because the sloth scene is where the film most visibly struggles to prevent us from agreeing with John Doe. Victor Aguillon has been lying in his apartment for a year. He has been kept alive through some grotesque medical ingenuity. IVs, tubes carefully maintained on the threshold of death, but never past it. When Somerset and Mills discover him, he has become almost unrecognizable as human. He is a body barely containing the minimum biological functions of life. He is, visually, one of the most disturbing images in the film. But here's what you need to hear. Victor had a court-appointed defense attorney who visited him 3 times at that apartment. 3 visits. And that attorney, that officer of the legal system, that designated protector of this man's rights, never reported what he saw. Let me say that again. A lawyer saw Victor's living conditions, conditions that were already, before Doe's intervention, evidence of catastrophic human neglect, and filed it away as low priority. Doe did not create Victor's condition. The system did. Victor's own choices did. Doe simply brought a year of slow, invisible self-destruction into violent, unignorable focus. He made the invisible sin visible. Is this wrong? Absolutely. Is it illegal? Obviously. Is it also, in some deeply uncomfortable way, a more honest confrontation with what was already happening than the legal system's 3 visits and filed reports? That question is Doe's argument. You're not supposed to answer it. You're supposed to feel it as a question. That discomfort, that involuntary recognition that the preacher has a point, even when the preacher is a monster, that is the congregation being prepared. Now look at Somerset's night in the library. After the sloth murder, Somerset goes to the Library of Congress. He researches Dante's Purgatorio. He reads Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He reads St. Thomas Aquinas on the 7 deadly sins. He sits in the glow of a reading lamp surrounded by books about moral theology and takes notes. The conventional reading treats this as detective work, Somerset educating himself to understand the killer's framework. That reading is accurate but incomplete. Watch Freeman's performance in that scene. He isn't just taking notes on a case. He is having an encounter with ideas that he finds genuinely troubling when he reads Aquinas' descriptions of the deadly sins, not as historical curiosities, but as operative diagnoses of human behavior. Something moves across his face that is not professional detachment. Something like recognition. Something like the terrible experience of reading a description that fits the world you have been watching for 25 years in a city that has exhausted your belief in human goodness. Somerset researches Doe's framework not because he needs to understand a madman. He researches it because he needs to understand why the madman is resonating. This is the film at its most subtle and most devastating, showing us that the most morally serious character in the story, the one whose judgment the audience trusts most, is the one who comes closest to understanding Doe's worldview. Somerset doesn't agree with Doe. He never will. But there is a version of Somerset's life path, a slightly darker turn somewhere in his past, where he might have. That's what Freeman is playing, the recognition that runs in parallel to the rejection. The congregation doesn't have to agree with the preacher to be changed by the sermon, it just has to listen. And Somerset listens. All of this, the apartment, the surrender, the car speech, the lust scenes, manufactured sin, Victor's systemic neglect, Somerset's midnight recognition, all of it is preparation. Preparation for the altar call. Preparation for the moment when Doe's sermon produces its intended fruit. The congregation has been assembled. Now comes the harvest. If you shoot him, he wins. 5 words. Morgan Freeman delivers them in a desert field with the urgency of a man who has understood everything 5 seconds too late. It's one of the most important lines in the film, and it is almost universally misread. The conventional reading treats it as Somerset saying, don't give Doe the satisfaction. Don't complete his plan. It's about denying Doe his victory. As if the content of Doe's victory is a personal triumph. The ego satisfaction of a psychopath who wanted to see his plan executed. As if this is about Doe's win or Mills's loss in the immediate drama of the scene. Somerset is saying something much more precise. And he knows exactly what he's saying because he is the only character in the film who has understood the theological argument that Doe has been making all along. If you shoot him, he wins means if you shoot him, you prove him right. You prove that when confronted with sufficient moral provocation, when the sin is real enough, when the loss is personal enough, when the anger is justified enough, even a good man will commit the act that his moral framework defines as murder. You prove that Doe's diagnosis of humanity is correct. You prove that wrath, not justice, is the operative moral force in human beings. You prove that the civilization Doe has been condemning is, at its core, as ungoverned by its own stated values as he has claimed. Somerset isn't asking Mills not to shoot because it would satisfy Doe. He's asking Mills not to shoot because it would validate Doe's entire argument about the human condition. Mills shoots. The argument is validated. Now, the box. The box is the single most famous prop in American cinema of the 1990s. Everyone who has ever seen or heard of Se7en knows about the box. What's in the box is a cultural meme. The reveal has been discussed, analyzed, deconstructed, and parodied in every possible medium for 30 years. And almost everyone discusses it wrong, because they discuss what's in the box, not what the box is. Here is what the box is. It is a weapon designed with surgical precision to produce the sin of wrath in a specific human being. That's it. That's the box's function. John Doe didn't kill Tracy Mills because he hated Mills or because Tracy was connected to any of his existing sin categories. He killed Tracy Mills, a person against whom he had no grievance, a pregnant woman entirely uninvolved in the investigation, because killing Tracy Mills was the only action capable of producing the precise emotional state necessary to make David Mills commit wrath. This is not a crime of passion. This is not even a crime of hate. This is a crime of engineering. Doe identified the one lever that, if pulled, would cause Mills to cross the line. He identified it weeks or months in advance. He cultivated it. He waited for the right moment. He arranged the box to be delivered at the exact location where Mills would have just enough information to be overwhelmed and just enough space from police restraint to be free. It is the most precise act of emotional manipulation in any thriller film I can think of. Silence of the Lambs gives us Hannibal Lecter, who manipulates Clarice psychologically over weeks. Zodiac gives us a killer whose identity remains opaque even to his pursuers. Neither of them achieves what Doe achieves, the engineering of a specific sin in a specific person on a specific schedule, with two witnesses present and a theological framework into which the act perfectly fits. This is not the work of a madman. This is the work of a craftsman. And now, the audience. I want you to think about what you felt in the moment before Mills pulled the trigger, not after. The dread and the horror came after. I want you to think about the moment before, the milliseconds during which your emotional response to what you had just learned was forming. You had just been told that the box contains Tracy Mills's head. You had just heard Doe describe why he did it. "I took her pretty head." You were watching Brad Pitt's face dissolve from confusion into comprehension, into a grief and rage so violent that the face itself seemed to be tearing apart. And you felt something. You felt the pull. You felt the absolute rightness of the response that was coming. You felt, for 1 second or for several seconds or for as long as it took Freeman's desperate sprint across the field to register as insufficient, that if Mills didn't pull that trigger, something would be wrong with the universe. Don't lie about this. Every person who watched Se7en in a theater in 1995, everyone who has watched it since, everyone who will watch it tomorrow, all of them had that moment. The moment when the human emotional architecture, the architecture that Doe understands better than any psychologist in the film, aligned perfectly with what Doe needed it to do. He wasn't designing the box for Mills. He was designing it for you. Mills was just the executor. You were the one whose moral logic needed to be scrambled, whose certainty in the rightness of wrath needed to be produced, whose response to Tracy's death was the final proof of Doe's argument about human nature. When you felt that Mills should shoot, when the deepest, most honest part of your emotional response said, "Yes, do it, he deserves it," you became John Doe's congregation. You became his proof. This proves the central thesis with absolute clarity. Se7en is not a film about Doe's 7 deadly sins. It is a film about the production of one sin in a mass audience, and every scene before the finale is a sermon designed to make you ready for your own moral compromise. The film is a conversion narrative, and the convert, in the end, is you. That's the evidence. Now let's address the objections, because they are serious and they deserve genuine engagement. Every time I've argued this reading of Se7en in classrooms, in arguments at 2 a.m., in comment sections I should have stayed out of, I've encountered 3 specific objections, not variations on the same objection. 3 distinct, intellectually serious challenges that deserve to be engaged honestly rather than dismissed. Here they are, stated as strongly as possible. Objection 1. John Doe is clinically insane. His worldview is not theology, it's the rationalization of a psychopath. Treating his arguments as coherent moral claims is like analyzing Charles Manson's lyrics for genuine philosophy. This is probably the most common objection, and it has real force. The logic runs like this. We don't spend time analyzing the philosophical positions of people who commit mass atrocities because the atrocities themselves demonstrate that the philosophical framework is broken. The methodology invalidates the argument. Doe kills people. Therefore, Doe is wrong. Engaging with his theology treats it as if it exists in a vacuum separate from the murders it produces, which is both analytically dishonest and morally problematic. There's genuine truth here. You should engage with this seriously before dismissing it. The history of cinema and culture is littered with the wreckage of audiences who romanticized articulate monsters because their articulation made the monstrousness feel meaningful. Hannibal Lecter, Anton Chigurh, Heath Ledger's Joker. There is a real and legitimate critical concern about the aestheticization of ideological violence, about treating evil as interesting rather than as what it is. But here's what this objection overlooks. Se7en never diagnoses John Doe. This is crucial. The film never gives us a psychologist's assessment of Doe's mental state. No one in the film, not the detectives, not the other characters, not the film's own narrative framing, ever definitively establishes that Doe is psychotic, delusional, or disconnected from reality. The closest thing to a psychiatric assessment is Somerset reading the journals, and what Somerset finds there is not evidence of psychosis, but evidence of a coherent, internally consistent moral framework that he himself finds genuinely troubling. Compare this to the way other films handle their violent ideologues. The Silence of the Lambs gives us a psychiatric file on Hannibal Lecter from the first scene. We know exactly what the film thinks of him clinically, even as it finds him aesthetically compelling. American Psycho frames its narrator as unreliable in ways that undermine Patrick Bateman's social criticism. Fight Club eventually reveals the psychological architecture of Tyler Durden's worldview. These films either diagnose their ideological villains or structurally undermine them. Se7en does neither. It presents Doe's argument, allows it to accumulate force across the entire narrative, shows its culmination, and then ends. The film doesn't give you Somerset explaining to Mills or to the audience why Doe was wrong. It gives you Somerset choosing to keep fighting despite not knowing whether Doe was wrong. That is a completely different moral posture. It is the posture of a person living under genuine uncertainty about the diagnosis of their civilization. The Doe is insane. Argument also has to contend with the fact that Doe's plan works. Not partially, not sort of, not in a villain achieves partial goals kind of way, completely. Every single element of what he sets out to accomplish occurs exactly as he designs it. The murders are committed. The theological framework is publicly established. He is apprehended on his own terms. He is taken to the desert. The box arrives. Mills shoots. If Doe's worldview is the product of a shattered mind, untethered from reality, his ability to execute a multi-month plan with zero deviations suggests a rather extraordinary break, one that operates more like focused genius than like mental illness. This proves the point. The "he's insane" objection is a way of avoiding what the film is asking us to confront. If Doe is insane, we can dismiss the argument and feel safe. If Doe is something more disturbing, a person of intelligence and conviction who has arrived at terrible conclusions through a recognizable moral reasoning process, then we have to engage with the argument. And engaging with the argument is uncomfortable because parts of it are right. Objection 2. Se7en is nihilistic. It doesn't make a moral argument. It depicts evil without commentary. Reading a complex theological thesis into a stylish crime thriller is overinterpretation. Fincher made a great thriller. That's it. This objection is more sophisticated than the first, and it's particularly prevalent in the critical tradition that treats Se7en as a formally accomplished genre film without deeper ideological ambitions. The argument is, not every dark film is making a moral argument about its darkness. Some films are just dark. Applying a complex theological reading to a movie about a serial killer is the kind of critical overreach that finds Marxist theory in children's cartoons and Jungian archetypes in action movies. Fincher told a story well. The end. There's something bracing about this argument. Film criticism does have a tendency toward interpretive overcrowding, the compulsion to find meaning where the filmmakers may have been content to produce sensation. And Fincher himself has been notably guarded about interpretations of his work, often preferring to discuss craft over meaning. But the nihilism reading falls apart under scrutiny. Nihilism. Actual nihilism, philosophical nihilism, is the position that nothing has inherent value or meaning. A nihilistic film would be one that makes no moral distinctions, that regards all outcomes as equivalent, that presents its events without ethical weight. Se7en is the opposite of this in every measurable way. The film makes moral distinctions constantly and urgently. Somerset's decision to stay is presented as meaningful. Mills's shooting is presented as tragic. Tracy's death is presented as the worst thing that can happen. The film is drenched in moral weight. Every scene, every interaction, every visual choice carries the weight of ethical judgment. What people mean when they call Se7en nihilistic is usually something more specific. They mean it doesn't offer a reassuring moral resolution. Evil wins in the conventional sense. The killer's plan succeeds. There is no catharsis where good triumphs and the audience is restored to moral comfort. This is not nihilism. This is what the Greeks called tragedy, a structure in which the audience is forced to confront something about human nature that it would prefer not to confront without the comfort of a tidy resolution. And if you need a formal argument for the film's intentionality rather than its accidental profundity, consider this. Andrew Kevin Walker's original script had an ending that the studio wanted to change. Test audiences found it too dark. New Line wanted something more conventional. Fincher and the cast fought to keep the ending. Brad Pitt made keeping the original ending a condition of his continued involvement in the film. Morgan Freeman, who has turned down bleak endings in other contexts, insisted on this one. These are not the actions of people who stumbled accidentally into nihilism. These are the actions of people who understood that this specific ending, the box, the trigger, the completion of Doe's plan, was the film's entire point. You don't go to the mat for an ending that's merely stylistically dark. You fight for an ending because it says something true that cannot be said any other way. What it says is the thesis, and the thesis is not nihilistic. It is deeply moral. It says, here is the sin of wrath, produced in real time, and here is the proof that it lives inside people who believe themselves to be righteous. That is a moral argument. It is an uncomfortable moral argument. It is an argument that indicts the audience rather than comforting them. But it is not nihilism. It is, if anything, the opposite, a deeply earnest belief that moral seriousness matters, expressed through a film that refuses to let you escape your own moral response to it. Objection. 3. Mills's wrath is completely justified. He just lost his pregnant wife to a sadistic killer who targeted her specifically to manipulate him. Calling Mill's response a sin and framing the audience's sympathetic reaction as moral complicity is victim-blaming dressed as philosophy. It pathologizes grief. This is the hardest objection. I want to sit with it longer than the others because it deserves that. The argument is essentially this. There is a moral difference between legitimate, responsive emotion, including anger at genuine, catastrophic injustice, and the theological category of wrath as a sin. When a man's pregnant wife is murdered to manipulate him, his rage is not sinful. It is human. It is appropriate. It is, in some moral frameworks, a sign of health rather than disease. A person who felt nothing in that situation would be the one with the moral problem. Calling Mills a sinner for responding with violent fury to the worst possible personal devastation is grotesque. It prioritizes philosophical cleanliness over basic human compassion, and the audience's response, wanting Mills to shoot, is not moral complicity with Doe's worldview. It's empathy. It's the natural, human, morally correct response to watching someone suffer an incomprehensible loss. Framing that empathic response as evidence of Doe's successful engineering is manipulative criticism. It takes a sign of the audience's humanity and reframes it as the audience's depravity. This argument is absolutely right in one dimension and absolutely wrong in another, and the distinction is the whole point. The argument is right that Mills's grief is legitimate. His love for Tracy is real. His devastation is real. His rage is human. Nothing in this essay is arguing that Mills is a bad person for feeling what he feels. The film itself doesn't make that argument. It is the most compassionate possible toward Mills at the moment of his worst sin. The argument is wrong about what the film is doing with that moment, because the film is not asking, is Mills's rage legitimate? It takes the legitimacy as given. What the film is asking, what Doe's entire plan is designed to ask, is, Does the legitimacy of the feeling change the nature of the act? When Mills pulls that trigger, is he executing justice or enacting wrath? Can something be simultaneously the most understandable human response in the world and the sin that Doe has spent 7 murders designing toward? The answer, the film insists, is yes. It can be both. And the reason this matters is not to condemn Mills, but to demonstrate, as Somerset knew, as Doe calculated, that the category of justified does not empty the category of sin. The most dangerous version of wrath is not the irrational rage of a person who has no cause. It is the morally immaculate fury of a person who has every cause. Because when anger is justified, the temptation to surrender to it completely is almost irresistible. The theological tradition from Augustine onward has always recognized this, which is why the capital sins are not about obviously corrupt motivations, but about the corruption of good ones. Pride is corrupted dignity, greed is corrupted need, and wrath, this specific wrath, is corrupted grief. And as for the audience's empathic response, here is the thing. The argument is not that feeling sympathetic toward Mills is wrong. The argument is that in the moment before the trigger, sympathy and wrath aligned, that what felt like empathy was also, simultaneously, the desire for revenge dressed in the clothes of justice. Doe doesn't need you to be a bad person to complete his argument. He needs you to be a normal person, a person whose righteous anger, under sufficient provocation, will override the moral framework you believe you live by. The objection, that response is just empathy, is actually Doe's strongest proof. Because if our empathic response can produce the desire for extrajudicial killing, then Doe has shown exactly what he set out to show, that the moral architecture of ordinary human beings, however sincerely maintained, can be collapsed by the right kind of pressure. That's not victim blaming. That's the film telling the truth about the human condition. All 3 objections, properly answered, strengthen the thesis rather than undermining it. The "he's insane" objection ignores the film's deliberate refusal to diagnose him. The "it's nihilism" objection mistakes tragedy for meaninglessness. The Mills is justified objection misunderstands the film's distinction between legitimate feeling and enacted sin, and then, inadvertently, demonstrates Doe's argument by insisting that justified anger is beyond moral examination. The defense rests. Now let's talk about why this matters. Se7en was released in September 1995. This is not a detail. It is the beginning of the argument's cultural scaffolding, because 1995 is a very specific American moment, one saturated in exactly the kinds of public moral crisis that Doe's argument addresses, and one that would, within 3 years, transform into the media environment, and within 30 years into the social media environment that makes his argument more relevant now than it was then. Let's start with the moment. The summer before Se7en's release, the United States had been riveted for months by the O.J. Simpson trial, not merely following it, riveted, obsessed, divided by it in ways that made family dinners dangerous and water cooler conversations impossible. The Simpson trial was the first trial that operated at the scale of mass entertainment. Live television, gavel to gavel, in every home. And what it produced, more than any verdict, more than any legal argument, was a national demonstration of the productivity of righteous anger. Everyone was furious. White America was furious at the verdict. Black America was furious at the history of acquittals that preceded it. Legal commentators were furious at the defense. Defense supporters were furious at the prosecution. The victim advocacy community was furious at the outcome. The Simpson trial taught America, or perhaps more accurately, revealed something that America had always known, that moral fury is the most powerful social mobilizer available, that justified anger, broadly shared, becomes impossible to resist or contain. The mid-1990s also saw the height of the so-called super predator panic. Criminologist John Doe's 1995 paper warned of a coming generation of young, conscienceless criminals, a moral panic that was largely fabricated but was wildly influential in shaping public discourse about crime, punishment, and the moral condition of American cities. The crime wave of the late 1980s and early 1990s was real. The super predator framing was not, but the framing was so successful because it attached the real anxiety to a specific moral narrative that there are people among us who are beyond ordinary human morality, who can only be understood through the lens of pure evil, and who therefore deserve responses that exist outside ordinary moral categories. This is the cultural climate into which Se7en arrived. A culture learning or relearning that mass-produced righteous anger is politically and emotionally irresistible. That justified is the switch that turns off the part of the moral brain that asks whether the response matches the provocation. David Fincher, whether consciously or through the kind of artistic intuition that operates below the level of deliberate argument, made a film that put a mirror up to that moment. John Doe's project, The Engineering of Righteous Fury as a Tool for Producing Sin, is a diagnosis of exactly what was happening in American public life in 1995. The country was being mobilized into various postures of moral outrage, each of them providing the emotional architecture for decisions that, viewed at a distance, would look troubling. And the device that was making this mobilization possible, television at that point, was doing something very specific. It was presenting human suffering as spectacle, amplifying the emotional response to that spectacle, and harvesting the resulting anger for various ideological purposes. Doe says in those notebooks that he wants the world to notice what it has normalized. He uses violence because he believes the spectacular is the only thing that breaks through the normalization. He is, in this sense, a theorist of what Guy Debord called the society of the spectacle, the idea that in a media-saturated culture, events must be transformed into spectacles in order to produce any emotional or political effect. What Doe provides is spectacle in service of moral outrage. What the OJ trial provided was spectacle in service of collective identity. What the crime panic provided was spectacle in service of political fear. The mechanism is identical, only the content. The Righteous Fury, Industrial Complex, 2026. In 2026, John Doe has a delivery mechanism he could not have designed but would absolutely recognize. Social media, Twitter X, Instagram, TikTok, whatever replaces them before this sentence ages, operates with a structural logic that is almost indistinguishable from Doe's theological project. It presents moral atrocities to mass audiences. It amplifies the emotional response. It validates and rewards anger as the correct and socially prestigious reaction. And it does something Doe could only do to two people in a desert field. It creates communities of shared wrath, tens of millions of people simultaneously convinced that their fury is the most righteous thing about them. Outrage culture is not a bug in the social media system. It is the system. The algorithmic architecture of every major platform has been built deliberately through optimization processes that prioritize engagement to surface content that produces strong emotional responses. And the strongest, reliably producible emotional response is moral indignation. The content that makes you angry gets more engagement than the content that makes you happy. The story that confirms the absolute wickedness of the people you already dislike outperforms the story that complicates your view of them. The atrocity is better content than the nuance. This is Doe's aesthetics of confrontation, automated and infinitely scalable. And what it produces in the audience, in the users, in everyone who participates in the daily ritual of online moral outrage is exactly what Doe produces in Mills. The absolute conviction that your anger is justified, therefore your anger is righteous, therefore anything your anger moves you toward is permissible. The rhetorical move is always the same. You are not being driven by rage. You are being driven by truth. You are not punishing people, you are holding them accountable. You are not participating in a mob, you are joining a movement. The distinction between rage and righteousness collapses deliberately, systematically, algorithmically, and what remains is wrath with a clear conscience. In this context, Se7en's thesis is not a historical curiosity. It is not an interesting reading of a 1990s thriller. It is the most urgent moral argument in American cinema, a film that identified with prophetic precision the mechanism by which ordinary people are converted into agents of wrath who believe themselves to be agents of justice. Doe's insight was this: you don't need to make people bad, you just need to find the right provocation. And the right provocation is always a real injustice, something that actually happened, that actually hurt someone, that a decent person should be angry about. The engineering of wrath doesn't require fabricating moral outrage. It requires amplifying legitimate moral outrage past the point where it submits to moral reasoning. Mills's rage at Tracy's death is real. The horror of what Doe did is real. The injustice is genuine, and it is precisely the genuineness of the injustice that makes the wrath irresistible and therefore most dangerous. Social media doesn't invent injustices. It finds real ones, amplifies them to maximum emotional pitch, strips them of context, and delivers them to audiences whose moral response has been pre-primed by hundreds of previous amplified injustices. The result is a population of people who are permanently in the emotional state that Mills is in when he stands in that field, convinced of the absolute righteousness of their fury, deaf to the Somerset voices saying, "If you do this, you prove them right." In 2026, there are no Somerset voices, or rather, the Somerset voices exist, but the algorithm buries them. Nuance doesn't engage. Complexity doesn't trend. The voice that says your anger is legitimate, but the action it's producing is dangerous, gets 3 likes and a ratio. The voice that says, "Are you going to let them get away with this?" goes viral. Doe predicted this, not the technology, the psychology, the theological architecture, wrath in the Christian tradition. To fully understand what Se7en is doing, you need to understand the theological category it is working with, because the 7 deadly sins are not a list of behaviors. They are a map of the ways that good impulses become destructive ones, and the tradition that developed them was not primarily interested in condemning vice. It was primarily interested in understanding the mechanism by which human beings who want to be good end up doing terrible things. The 7 deadly sins trace back to Evagrius Ponticus, a 4th century monk who identified what he called the 8 evil thoughts, logismoi, that interfered with the contemplative life. Pope Gregory the Great reduced the list to 7 in the 6th century. Thomas Aquinas systematized the tradition in the 13th century in the Summa Theologica. And what Aquinas understood, with characteristic analytical precision, was that the deadly sins are called deadly, not because they are the worst individual acts, but because they are the root causes from which other sins grow. They are generative. They are productive of further evil. Wrath is not the worst of the 7 in most traditional rankings. That distinction typically goes to pride, the root of Lucifer's fall, the sin from which all others spring. But wrath occupies a special position in the theological tradition because it is the most socially productive sin. Wrath, unlike pride or envy, is inherently outward-facing. It requires an object, it requires a target, and it requires, almost always, the sense that the target deserves what it receives. Aquinas distinguishes between what he calls iracundia, the appetite for revenge, and the passion of anger itself, which can be legitimate. The sin of wrath is not anger per se. It is the appetite for revenge that exceeds what justice requires, or that substitutes the satisfactions of revenge for the requirements of justice. The critical distinction is wrath doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like justice. The person in the grip of capital W. Wrath is not aware of having crossed a line, because from the inside, the desire for retribution and the desire for justice are phenomenologically identical. They feel the same. The difference is visible only from the outside or in retrospect. This is the theological precision that Se7en is working with. Mills in the field is not feeling revenge. He is feeling justice. He is feeling the absolute, morally clarifying certainty that pulling the trigger is the right thing, that Doe deserves to die, that the world will be better, more just, more correctly ordered if he acts. The desire for justice and the sin of wrath are, in his experience at that moment, indistinguishable. Doe knows this. This is the theology he has been working with for years. He doesn't choose the sin of wrath for the finale because it's the most dramatic. He chooses it because it is the sin that wears the best disguise. It is the sin that presents itself as its own antidote. And Somerset knows this too. If you shoot him, he wins, is the most theologically literate line in the film. It is Somerset understanding, perhaps from those nights in the library with Aquinas and Chaucer, that the production of justified wrath is the most sophisticated theological argument Doe can make. Because if Mills shoots, and he does, then Doe has demonstrated that even a genuinely good man under genuine provocation can be made to commit the sin he was sworn to prevent. This is the theological argument of Se7en, made legible through the tradition it draws on, that the most dangerous sins are not the sins of wickedness, but the sins of misapplied virtue. That the deadliest wrath is righteous wrath. That the world is most dangerous, not when evil people do evil things, but when good people do evil things and call them justice. The comparative frame, why Se7en is different. It's worth spending a few hundred words distinguishing this argument from the films it's often grouped with, because the distinction clarifies what Se7en is specifically doing. The Silence of the Lambs gives us the brilliant, evil monster as a kind of dark companion figure. Lecter helps Clarice in his twisted way, and the film's architecture is built around her heroism. Lambs is ultimately about a young woman's triumph over circumstances that would crush her. It's humanistic in its bones, even with Hannibal lurking in the margins. Zodiac, Fincher's own later film, and in many ways a companion piece to Se7en, is about the failure of institutions and individuals to solve a case, about how evil sometimes simply wins by wearing society down. It's a film about the costs of obsession, and while it's profoundly dark, its darkness is the darkness of frustration and institutional failure rather than theological argument. Se7en is doing something neither of these films attempts. It is not about the heroism of the investigator. It is not about institutional failure. It is about the moment of moral choice, the moment when the audience and the protagonist are simultaneously in the grip of an emotion that feels like righteousness and something else. It is the only major American thriller I can think of that is primarily concerned not with catching the killer, but with what the killer is doing to the moral faculties of the people trying to catch him. This is what places Se7en in a tradition that has more to do with Dostoevsky than with Hitchcock. Crime and Punishment is not really about a murder. It's about the philosophical framework that made the murder feel justified and the process by which that framework collapses. The brothers Karamazov gives us Ivan's Grand Inquisitor, a theological argument so compelling that it cannot be simply refuted, only lived against. Se7en gives us Doe in the same tradition, an argument that is made through action rather than speech, that cannot be simply dismissed, that must be lived against. Somerset's choice to stay in the city, his final, modest, unspectacular act of resistance against Doe's worldview, is the film's answer to the argument, not a refutation, a response. A choice to keep fighting, not because the diagnosis is wrong, but because the cure Doe prescribes is worse than the disease. That is the context. That is why Se7en matters in 2026, not as a thriller, not as a formal achievement, as a theological argument about the production and weaponization of righteous anger, an argument that has become, in the 30 years since the film's release, the defining mechanism of public life. Now let's talk about how Fincher made the argument with his camera. There's a critical mistake that most technical analysis of Se7en makes. It treats the film's visual and sound choices as serving the genre, as building the atmosphere, creating the dread, establishing the noir world. And that's accurate as far as it goes. Darius Khondji's cinematography is genuinely extraordinary. Howard Shore's score is genuinely unsettling. The production design is genuinely immersive. The craft is real, and it deserves acknowledgement. But acknowledging that the craft serves the genre misses what the craft is actually doing in service of the thesis. Every major technical choice in Se7en is not just building dread, it is building a specific kind of dread, the dread of a moral argument you cannot refute. The craft is not horror craft, it is sermon craft. Let me show you 3 specific choices and what each of them is doing. The cinematography, a world that has already been condemned, Darius Khondji was one of the most distinctive cinematographers working in Hollywood in the mid-1990s, and Se7en remains the defining showcase for his aesthetic sensibility. The film is famous for its visual look, desaturated, almost draining color away from everything except red and yellow, dominated by rain and shadow, lit in ways that make even daylight scenes feel dim and oppressive. The city is wet, the walls are dark, the people are pale. Everything exists in a state of visual depletion. The conventional reading of this aesthetic is genre functional. This is noir, and noir looks like this. The visual world creates the atmosphere of doom that the story requires. Fincher and Khondji chose this look because it fits the conventions of the serial killer thriller. But look at what the visual world is actually arguing. John Doe's apartment, when we finally see it, is the most visually coherent space in the film. It's bare, yes, and cold, but its bareness is a kind of purity. The notebooks line the walls in perfect, almost library order. The objects in the space are purposeful, compared to the crime scenes, which are saturated with the evidence of excess, food waste, flesh, filth, the material detritus of consumption and neglect. Doe's apartment is almost restful. This is not accidental. Khondji's visual scheme creates a world in which excess and degradation are the visual norm, and austerity, even Doe's monastic, violent austerity, reads as a kind of clarity. The camera is making a visual argument. This world, as it is visually condemned already. It looks like it deserves what is happening to it. This is extraordinarily dangerous filmmaking if you stop to think about it. The visual world of Se7en is designed to make Doe's diagnosis feel credible to the eye. The city is ugly. The lives being lived in it are ugly. The visual evidence of gluttony and sloth and lust is everywhere you look, not in the crime scene specifically, but in the ordinary texture of daily life as the film presents it. Somerset's walk to work, the apartment buildings, the diner, the police station. Everything is slightly decayed, slightly insufficient, slightly saturated in the evidence of a civilization that has stopped caring about its own dignity. You walk into this film through Doe's eyes, not because the film endorses his conclusions, but because it has pre-accepted his visual premise that this world, as presented, looks like a world that deserves condemnation. The cinematography primes you for his argument before he makes it. By the time Doe starts talking in the back of that car, you have been looking at his evidence for 90 minutes. The craft choice and the theological argument are inseparable. Khondji's visual world is Doe's sermon illustrated. The editing, the crimes you never see. Now we arrive at what is, technically, the most sophisticated choice in Se7en, and the one that most directly supports the thesis. Fincher never shows you the crimes. Let me be precise. You see the aftermath. You see the victims in their various states of destruction. You see the crime scenes as spaces saturated in evidence of what occurred. but you never see the crimes committed. You never watch the gluttony murder happen. You never see Victor's degradation as it progresses. You never see the lust scene's central act. You never see Tracy's death. The murders in real time are invisible. This is an extraordinary choice for a film that is, ostensibly, about a serial killer. The conventional thriller grammar practically demands that you show at least some version of the crime being committed, to establish stakes, to create visceral horror, to demonstrate the villain's power. Fincher refuses every single time. Why? Because showing the crimes would tell you what to think. It would give you the completed picture, the full moral image, the interpretable event. You would process it, experience your response, and move on. Showing the crimes would make them content, something to observe and react to. Not showing the crimes makes them something else entirely. It makes them a space that your imagination fills. And what your imagination fills that space with, the images your mind generates in the absence of visual information are, by definition, shaped by everything you carry into the film. Your anxieties, your moral framework, your sense of what constitutes the worst possible thing. The film doesn't show you the crimes, it makes you imagine them. And what you imagine, in the dark, with Howard Shore's score doing what we're about to discuss, is worse than anything Fincher could have shown you. This is the craft in acting the thesis. By withholding the images of the crimes, Fincher turns you into an active participant in the film's horror. You are not passively receiving images of evil, you are producing them. Your imagination is the location where the crimes actually occur, where they are most vivid, most tailored to your specific fears, most capable of producing the emotional state that Doe needs from you by the time the box arrives. You haven't been watching a serial killer movie. You have been committing the crimes in your own head, with your own imaginative resources, for 90 minutes. And then, when the box appears, your imagination is already so primed, so saturated in your own private versions of Doe's crimes, that what you imagine is in the box, even before Mills says anything, is viscerally real in a way that no filmed image could achieve. This is genius filmmaking, and it is entirely in service of the film's theological argument that you are not a passive observer of this story. You are a participant. The editing's strategic withholding transforms you from audience member into congregation. You don't watch the sermons, you experience them from the inside. The score, the architecture of inevitability. Howard Shore is best known in the popular imagination for The Lord of the Rings, for the expansive, thematic, orchestral work that gave Tolkien's world its emotional vocabulary. But his work on Se7en is arguably more sophisticated because it is doing something Shore's more celebrated scores do not attempt. It is removing the possibility of moral escape. Thriller scores typically do one of two things. They build tension toward a resolution, mounting pressure that releases when the plot resolves, giving the audience a physical experience of stakes and payoff. Or they create atmosphere, a tonal environment that tells you how to feel about what you're seeing. Shore's Se7en score does neither of these things consistently. What it does instead is build not tension, but inevitability. There's a specific quality to the score throughout the film's second half, from Doe's surrender onward, that resists the conventional thriller grammar of escalating tension. The music doesn't get more urgent in the way that thriller scores get urgent. It gets heavier, more settled, more certain. It sounds like something closing, not like something building. The music in the final act of Se7en sounds like a conclusion that has always been coming, not like a crisis that might resolve differently. This is the architecture of a sermon's final movement. In the structure of evangelical preaching, the tradition that Doe's theatrical flourishes most clearly invoke, the sermon builds through evidence and argument toward what preachers call the altar call, the moment when the congregation is asked to make a decision. The altar call is the most emotionally loaded moment in the service. It is the convergence point of everything that preceded it. And the musical tradition of evangelical services builds toward the altar call, not with urgency, but with inevitability. with the sense that the decision being asked for is not a crisis, but a reckoning, not a surprise, but a fulfillment. Shore's score in Se7en's final act is structured as an altar call. The music tells you, from the moment Doe surrenders, that this is all going to end in one specific way. Not because the music telegraphs the plot, but because it creates an emotional environment in which the ending is not a shock, but a completion. When Mills pulls the trigger, the score does not produce the musical equivalent of "this is terrible." It produces the musical equivalent of "this was always where we were going." That is the preacher's instrument, used with extraordinary precision. The score removes your sense of contingency. It makes the sin feel inevitable. An inevitable sin is the sin that never gets examined because it never presented itself as a choice. The performance, Kevin Spacey as reasonable man, one last craft element, the most discussed and least understood. Kevin Spacey's performance as John Doe is consistently described as chilling, a word that functions as critical shorthand for effective villain performance. He is praised for his restraint, his calm, his intelligence. These are accurate observations, but they miss what makes the performance genuinely disturbing. Spacey plays Doe as reasonable, not as trying to seem reasonable, not as menacing beneath the calm surface. Reasonably, as a person whose worldview is coherent, who has thought through his positions, and who is entirely at peace with the conclusions he has reached. The performance has no subterranean violence trying to escape, no madness waiting to break through, no indication that the calm is a performance in itself. Doe is calm because he has resolved his doubts. He is the opposite of unhinged. He is the most fully committed, philosophically settled person in any scene he occupies. This makes him genuinely more disturbing than any amount of scenery-chewing menace could achieve. A ranting, violent, visibly unhinged Doe would be easy to dismiss. The madman is always dismissible. You just don't engage with the argument because the arguer's condition invalidates the argument. Spacey's Doe provides no such escape. His composure forces engagement. You cannot dismiss him on the grounds of obvious pathology. You have to actually engage with what he's saying, and what he's saying is, in places, genuinely troubling. This is the performance serving the thesis. Spacey's Doe is cast as a reasonable man making an argument, not a monster enacting evil. The craft choice at every level, from casting to direction to performance, refuses to give you the madman you're looking for. It gives you instead the preacher, composed, convicted, coherent, and devastating. That is how Fincher builds his church, with light that condemns a world that perhaps deserves it, with editing that makes you commit the sins in your own imagination, with a score that makes the altar call feel inevitable, and with a performance that refuses to let you dismiss the sermon by dismissing the preacher. Now, the reckoning. Let's start where the film ends and then go back to the beginning. Mills is in the desert. Doe is dead. Somerset has his gun. The helicopter is coming. Somerset says something that the film has always been praised for, the Hemingway line. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for. I agree with the second part. It's a beautiful line, a humanistic ending note, a modest affirmation of perseverance in the face of catastrophe. Critics and audiences point to it as the film's final word, the small, quiet assertion that Somerset, at least, will keep going. That good, however battered, endures. Here's what that line actually is. It's a concession. Somerset doesn't say the world is fine. He explicitly agrees that the world is not fine. He agrees tacitly with Doe's diagnosis. The world is not a fine place. The world is. The film has shown you this for 2 hours. A place saturated in sin, neglect, excess, and the quiet desperation of people who have given up on decency while maintaining the performance of it. Somerset has spent 25 years watching the city be exactly what Doe says it is. He doesn't contradict Doe's description of the world. He just chooses to fight in it anyway. This is not a triumphant note. It is an exhausted, honest, minimal note. It is the note of a man who has just watched his partner become a murderer in fulfillment of a serial killer's theological project, who has just seen the worst possible version of what his career has been building toward, and who is choosing, not out of optimism, but out of something more like stubbornness, to stay in the fight. Somerset is not the film's answer to Doe. He is the film's refusal to be destroyed by Doe. Those are different things, and the difference matters because it clarifies what kind of hope the film is actually offering. It is not offering the hope of refutation, the hope that Doe is wrong, that the world is better than he thinks, that goodness will win. It is offering the hope of persistence, the hope that knowing someone might be partly right about the world's darkness does not require you to accept their prescription for it. Somerset stays not because he has won the argument. He stays because leaving would be the other version of Mills's sin, the sin of withdrawal, of apathy, of refusing to engage with a broken world because engaging with it is costly. This is the film's theology in miniature. And it is, I would argue, a more rigorous and honest theology than the nihilism reading allows for. What Doe's argument actually was. Let me do something that the conventional reading never attempts. Let me reconstruct Doe's theological argument, not as it appears in the film's dialogue, but as the film's narrative structure implies it. Doe's argument, as evidenced by his crimes and his eventual self-presentation, runs something like this. Human civilization has normalized the 7 deadly sins, not merely tolerated them, normalized them, built its economics around gluttony and greed, built its media around pride and lust, built its social structures around the slow violence of sloth, the abandonment of the vulnerable, the pretense that not acting is not sinning. The culture has become so saturated in these normalized vices that they have become invisible. No one is held accountable. No one pays a price proportionate to the damage caused. The law does not address spiritual damage. The media rewards it. The economy depends on it. The only way to force recognition of this normalization, the only way to make the invisible visible, is through spectacular confrontation. Force the culture to look at its own sins in the most literal, extreme, unavoidable form. Make the private public. Make the normalized grotesque. Drag the slow violence of sloth into a crime scene and make the detective look at what a year of neglect actually produces on a human body. And then, this is the crucial final step. Demonstrate that even the agents of order, even the people whose job is to oppose sin and maintain justice, can be made to commit the sin they are supposed to prevent. Demonstrate that wrath is not the province of the wicked. It is the final capacity of the righteous. It is what justice becomes when it is stripped of patience and mercy and self-restraint. Show that the detectives, the good people, the ones we trust, are as capable of the worst sin as anyone. Doe has punished. This is Doe's argument, and the film's narrative validates every single step of it. The question the film leaves you with, the question that Somerset refuses to answer in his final monologue, is not, was Doe wrong? It is, was Doe wrong in a way that should change anything? And the honest answer, the answer the film won't give you but points toward, is, we don't know. We don't know because the argument is still running. Because the world Doe diagnosed has not changed. Because the mechanisms he identified, the normalization of sin, the invisibility of systemic damage, the weaponization of justified anger, have not disappeared. They have expanded. They have been industrialized. Somerset stays because he doesn't know either. He stays not because the fight is winnable, but because it is worth having, even if the outcome is uncertain. The box's mirror. I want to return to the box one final time because we have not exhausted what it means. The box contains Tracy Mills's head. That is the literal content. But what the box contains, functionally, as an object in the film's theological architecture, is a mirror. Doe places the box in the field not to show Mills what he has lost. Mills knows what he has lost. The phone call with the detective makes that clear before the box arrives. But to show Mills what he is about to do, the box is the final test of the thesis. The question the box poses is, given a real injustice, a genuine and devastating loss, a provocation that is as morally legitimate as any provocation can be, will you choose the sin of wrath? Will you pull the trigger? Mills's answer, yes, immediately. Without hesitation, despite Somerset's warning, despite knowing at some level what Doe wants, despite having spent the entire film as someone who understood, intellectually, at least, that this was a man who wanted to be killed. Mills shoots, and the mirror faces outward, because now the question is yours. Not, was Mills wrong to shoot? That question has an obvious emotional answer and a more complicated moral one, and we've already explored the tension between them. The question the mirror poses is, were you wrong to want him to shoot? Think about that specific desire, the one I described in the opening pages of this essay, the one you probably felt and then quickly explained away as empathy. Were you wrong to feel it? Most people, when they ask themselves honestly, find that they cannot cleanly answer yes. The desire felt so legitimate in the moment. Doe had just murdered Mills's pregnant wife specifically to produce that desire. How could wanting the murderer to be punished be wrong? How could sympathy for Mills's grief be a moral failing? And that inability to cleanly say, yes, I was wrong, that ambivalence, that hesitation, is the mirror's image. That is what the box is showing you about yourself. Not that you are evil, not that your empathy is tainted, but that the line between righteous anger and the sin of wrath is thinner than you thought, more easily crossed than you believed, and more difficult to locate from the inside than any moral philosophy has adequately prepared you for. This is the film's deepest thesis, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The most dangerous moment in any person's moral life is the moment when they are absolutely certain they are right. Certainty of righteousness is not a moral achievement, it is a moral risk. It is the state of mind in which the sin of wrath is not only possible but probable, because it presents itself not as sin but as justice, and justice feels so clean, so necessary, so obviously correct that resisting it feels perverse. You were certain Mills was right. That certainty was Doe's final achievement. What this interpretation costs you. Accepting this reading of Se7en costs you something. That's worth being direct about. It costs you the comfortable experience of the film as a thriller about other people's darkness. It costs you the ability to watch the ending with the guilty catharsis that Fincher actually engineered. The, I know this is wrong, but I wanted it, feeling that can be processed as aesthetic response and set aside. It costs you the nihilism interpretation, because nihilism, as I've argued, is the comfortable reading, the reading that says the film is dark and bleak and therefore about a broken world rather than about you specifically. In exchange for these things, this reading gives you something harder and more valuable, a film that is genuinely teaching you something. Not about serial killers, not about the darkness of human nature in the abstract, about your specific moral architecture, about the conditions under which you specifically will decide that anger has become justice, and justice requires action that, viewed from outside, is clearly violent. This is what great film can do, not show you beautiful images, though Se7en has those, not tell you a compelling story, though it has that too, make you complicit in something you didn't agree to be complicit in, and then leave you with the evidence. The evidence is the desire you felt. The evidence is the millisecond of yes before the horror settled. The evidence is the fact that you have never, since the first time you saw this film, been entirely comfortable with your response to that ending. That discomfort is the sermon landing. Rewatch. Instructions. So rewatch it, not as a thriller, not as a formal exercise. Rewatch it as a theological document addressed specifically to you. Count how many times the camera shows you a world that looks like it deserves condemnation. Count how many of Doe's social critiques, his anger at neglect, at normalization, at the invisibility of sin, land as valid even as his methods remain unambiguously monstrous. Watch Somerset's face in the library and look for the moment when he is not taking notes but genuinely reckoning. Listen to what Doe says in the car and ask yourself, sentence by sentence, where he is wrong, and be honest about the sentences where you cannot immediately identify the error. And then watch the ending again. Watch for your own response. That desire, that flash of aligned fury. Watch it come. Don't explain it away this time. Don't route it back to empathy and call it clean. Sit with it. That desire is the film's thesis proven in real time, in your own moral faculties, for however many minutes it takes you to remember that the feeling and the act are not the same thing, and that the work of not crossing that line is not a small thing or an obvious thing, or a thing that can be accomplished simply by being a good person with good intentions. Somerset knew this. It's why he stays, not because the world is fine, not because good wins, because the work of not becoming what you fight is endless, unglamorous, and the only worthy response to a world where John Doe's argument is always, partially, demonstrably correct. What's in the box is you. Go watch the film again. But we haven't asked the right question about Somerset. We've treated him as the film's moral anchor, the wise, experienced, morally serious man who chooses decency over despair, the counterweight to Doe, the argument against the argument, the reason Se7en is not nihilistic. Morgan Freeman's gravity and warmth make this reading feel not just correct, but necessary. He is, after all, the most dignified presence in any room the film puts him in, and dignity in a film this dark reads instinctively as moral authority. That reading is true. It is also dangerously incomplete, because the film has been showing us something else about Somerset in parallel, something that Freeman's performance naturalizes so effectively that most viewers absorb it without registering its implications. Somerset didn't choose decency over despair. He chose despair with decency. He chose to keep moving inside a worldview that has already substantially conceded Doe's diagnosis. His persistence is real. His goodness is real, but the philosophical ground he is standing on when the film begins is closer to Doe's ground than anyone, including the film's admirers, including Somerset himself, would be comfortable acknowledging. This is the argument Module 7 makes, that the most disturbing thing about Se7en is not John Doe. It is the fact that the film's hero and its villain have arrived through entirely different paths at virtually the same reading of the world and are separated not by what they see, but by what they choose to do with what they see. That separation is real. It matters enormously, but it is smaller and more fragile than the film's moral architecture wants it to be. And Somerset knows it, which is why he sleeps with a metronome. The two apartments start here because the film starts here, or rather, because the film's visual grammar establishes this parallel in the first 20 minutes and then trusts you to carry it through to the end. Somerset's apartment is shown early. It is spare. A bed, a desk, books. A specific and curated set of books, not the accumulation of a life, but the selection of a man who has thought carefully about what he needs and what he doesn't. There are no photographs on the walls, no evidence of a social life preserved in objects, no mementos of colleagues or relationships that have meant something over 25 years of career. The apartment is the space of a man who has pared his life down to essentials, and not because he can't afford more, not because circumstances have stripped things from him, but because he has chosen this. The sparseness is deliberate, purposeful, monastic. John Doe's apartment, when they find it, is also spare, also purposeful, also stripped of the personal detritus of ordinary life. The notebooks line the walls in ordered rows. The objects present serve the mission. There are no photographs, no mementos, no evidence of relationships maintained. The apartment is organized around a single sustained project, the intellectual and theological work that produced the murders. Put the two apartments side by side in your mind. The formal parallel is exact. Two men have made the same choice about how to live, stripped down, focused, insulated from the ordinary noise and attachment of social existence. Two men have decided that the world requires a response serious enough to warrant the sacrifice of comfort, companionship, the accumulated warmth of an ordinary life. The difference that matters, the difference that the film is built on, is what response they have settled on. Somerset chose patient observation and exhausted persistence. Doe chose spectacular intervention and willing self-destruction, but they started from the same place. They both looked at the world and found it insufficient, found it worth sacrificing ordinary happiness to engage with seriously, found the distractions of normal life inadequate to the scale of what they were confronting. This is not a surface parallel. This is the film's deepest structural move, placing its moral hero and its theological villain in identical relationships to the world, then asking, with the quiet patience that only great cinema can afford, whether the difference between them is as large as we need it to be. The metronome Somerset uses a metronome to sleep. This is a detail so casually introduced that most viewers absorb it as character texture, a quirky habit that makes Somerset vivid, an eccentric touch that humanizes the wise older detective. The film gives it to you in a single scene, without underlining it, without asking you to think about it too hard. Freeman plays the moment with complete naturalness. He sets the metronome, lies down, closes his eyes. Stop. Don't let the naturalness of the performance move you past the detail. A metronome is a device for imposing rhythm on chaos. It creates an artificial regularity, a mechanical heartbeat, to substitute for a natural one that is, for some reason, insufficient. Musicians use metronomes when their internal sense of tempo cannot be trusted. Surgeons, in training, use rhythm devices to regulate fine motor work when their hands are uncertain. You use an external regulator when the internal one has broken down, or when the internal one has been so thoroughly disrupted by circumstance that it can no longer be relied upon. Somerset uses a metronome to sleep because the chaos in his mind, the 25 years of crime scenes, of human damage, of the accumulated evidence of what the city does to people and what people do to each other, will not quiet itself without mechanical assistance. His mind, left to its own internal rhythm, will not settle. The thoughts will not stop. The evidence will not stop presenting itself. The argument, Doe's argument, or something very like it, will not stop running. The metronome is the most honest thing in the film about Somerset's actual psychological condition. It tells you that the equanimity you see in his face during the day is the product of discipline and effort, not of genuine peace. It tells you that at night, without the discipline, without the work and the purpose and the forward motion of investigation, what he is left with is the unmediated experience of everything he has seen, and that experience cannot be managed without external intervention. John Doe fills 300 notebooks. Somerset sets a metronome. Both of them have found a mechanism for managing the unmanageable weight of what they know about the world. Doe's mechanism eventually produces murder. Somerset's produces insomnia and mechanical rhythm. The outputs are completely different. The inputs are identical. This is the film asking you to hold a very uncomfortable thought, that the difference between a man like Somerset and a man like Doe is not a difference in what they see or what they feel. It is a difference in what they do with it. And what they do with it is, in both cases, a choice, an active, sustained, daily choice that could, conceivably, have been made differently. Somerset chose the metronome. Doe chose the notebooks. The city made both choices necessary, and the city continues, unchanged, the diagnosis they share. Let me reconstruct Somerset's worldview from the evidence the film actually provides, not the worldview critics attribute to him based on Freeman's warmth, but the worldview his words and choices demonstrate. Somerset is leaving. This is established in the film's opening minutes. He has arranged his retirement, planned his move to the country, decided, after 25 years, that the city cannot be saved, that the fight is unwinnable, that the cost of continued engagement exceeds anything he can justify to himself. He is not leaving because of one bad case, one final straw. He is leaving because the accumulated evidence of a career has produced a conclusion. This is not getting better. His presence has not changed it. More presence will not change it. This is Doe's conclusion. Word for word, it is Doe's conclusion. The world does not respond to ordinary engagement. The normalization of sin has produced a civilization that cannot be reformed through patient, legitimate effort. The conventional mechanisms, law, order, investigation, prosecution are insufficient to the scale of what is wrong. Somerset acts on this conclusion by leaving. Doe acts on it by staying and escalating. But the conclusion is the same. Look at Somerset's dialogue throughout the film. This isn't going to have a happy ending. People don't want a champion. They want a mirror. The line about retirement, he speaks about the countryside with the specific, focused relief of a man whose relationship to hope has been so thoroughly damaged that he can only imagine it in the most stripped-down private form. Not the hope of changing things, but the hope of not being in the place where things are unchangeable. He is not going to the country to do something. He is going to the country to stop seeing. Even his research, the library night we've already discussed, is delivered in a register of recognition rather than discovery. When Somerset reads Aquinas on the deadly sins, he is not learning something new. He is finding a theoretical vocabulary for something he has already experienced empirically. The sins are not abstract categories to him. They are a description of his career. He knows about sloth, about the slow, invisible damage of negligence, because he has been in Victor's apartment equivalent 100 times, not as extreme, not as staged, but recognizable. He knows about wrath because he has felt it, managed it, suppressed it across decades of watching guilty people walk and innocent people suffer. Somerset's library research is not detective work. It is the most educated man in the film, finding a framework that describes what he already knows, and what he already knows is, substantially, what Doe knows. The difference, again, is the prescription. Somerset's response to the shared diagnosis is to leave, and then, at the end, to stay. Doe's response is to punish and then to die. These are different choices. They are not different worldviews. This is the film's most carefully concealed structural argument, that Doe's worldview is not the alien pathology of a broken mind, but the extreme version of a perspective that the film's most admirable character also holds. Somerset is the proof that you can arrive at Doe's diagnosis and remain decent. But he is also the proof that arriving at Doe's diagnosis and remaining decent is extraordinarily difficult, that it requires the daily effort of the metronome, the discipline of a man who has stripped his life to essentials precisely so he can maintain his humanity in a world that erodes it. So what is the difference? If they share the diagnosis, if both men have spent their lives in a world that confirms Doe's argument at every turn, what is the actual operative distinction between the man who sets the metronome and the man who fills the notebooks? The easy answer is methodology. Somerset doesn't kill people. Doe does. The moral distinction is clear and absolute and does not require philosophical investigation. But that answer, while correct, is insufficient because it describes the output without explaining the mechanism. What is it in Somerset's character or circumstances or choices that produced a different methodology from the same input? What is the actual internal difference between them that resulted in one choosing patient persistence and the other choosing violent escalation? The film, to its credit, doesn't give you a clean answer. It gives you fragments. There is the woman Somerset is leaving, the suggestion of a relationship that still exists, however attenuated, however difficult his isolation has made it. There is his relationship with Mills, which develops across the film from irritated professionalism into something that resembles, however briefly, genuine mentorship. There is his connection to the precinct captain, to the rhythms of institutional life that, for all his frustration with them, have given his days structure and purpose. Somerset is isolated, yes, but he is not completely isolated. There are threads, thin, strained, but present, connecting him to other people, to specific human beings whose faces he knows and whose existence makes claims on him. Doe has no such threads. His apartment is a monk's cell, but a monk who has cut every connection. There is no suggestion anywhere in the film of a relationship that Doe maintains, a person whose face he remembers with anything other than contempt or theological abstraction. His isolation is complete, and his worldview has been developed entirely in the absence of specific human connection, built from observation, from abstract analysis of sin categories, from the view of humanity as a mass of behavioral patterns rather than a collection of specific people with specific faces and specific claims on your attention. Somerset's persistence is not grounded in a philosophical argument that the world is better than Doe thinks. It is grounded, just barely, just enough, in the specific human beings he is still connected to. Not in optimism, in attachment, in the most basic, irreducible form of moral obligation, the face of another person known to you making a claim on your continued presence. This is the film's answer, and the film is honest about how small it is, how easily it could fail, how much it depends on maintaining those threads of connection in a world that systematically frays them. Somerset's decency is not a philosophical achievement. It is a relational one. It survives because he is not quite alone enough to let it go. Doe got there first. He reached complete isolation before Somerset did, and in complete isolation, with only the abstract mass of humanity to observe and the theological framework to apply, the diagnosis produced the prescription it always would, without a single specific face to interrupt the logic. This is the most frightening thing Se7en argues about human nature, that the difference between decency and atrocity may be, in the end, the difference between isolation and connection, between having someone whose face you know and having only the category of humanity, between the specific and the abstract. The specific always complicates, the abstract always simplifies. And simplified worldviews, applied with conviction, produce exactly what Doe produces. Which brings us back to the ending, and to the choice Somerset makes that the film frames as its small, exhausted, necessary act of hope. He is going to stay. We've read this as Somerset refusing to be defeated, as the persistence of goodness, as the Hemingway second part, the world worth fighting for even when it is not a fine place. All of this is true and genuinely moving. Somerset's metronome is still running, but nobody can hear it anymore. That is not a metaphor. It is the precise description of what happened to Somerset's kind of moral persistence in the 30 years between Se7en's release and the world you are living in right now. The metronome, that patient, mechanical insistence on rhythm, on deliberation, on the slow regulation of chaos into something manageable, was not destroyed. It was simply drowned out, not by evil, not by any single catastrophic moral failure. By infrastructure, by the architecture of attention that was built, piece by piece, optimization by optimization, engagement metric by engagement metric, into the environment where moral decisions now have to be made. John Doe needed 2 detectives, 7 crimes, and several months to engineer the conditions for one act of wrath. Twitter can do it in 45 minutes, at scale, to 50 million people simultaneously. with no Somerset in the field to say stop. This is where we end, not with the film, with what the film was diagnosing before the diagnosis had a name, and with the question that 30 years of rewatches and essays and film school syllabi have studiously, collectively, almost conspiratorially avoided. If we understood what Se7en was arguing, if we absorbed its lesson, if we wrote about it and taught it and praised it for its moral seriousness, why are we still in Doe's congregation? Why, with the blueprint in hand, did we build his church anyway? The 5 steps, codified? Before applying Doe's mechanism to the present, we need to name it precisely, because one of the ways a mechanism avoids scrutiny is by remaining implicit, by operating below the level of formal description where it can be felt but not examined. Here are the 5 steps of Doe's theological project, extracted from everything the preceding 7 modules have argued. Step 1. Identify a real injustice. This is non-negotiable, and it is the step that makes Doe's argument unfalsifiable from the inside. The injustice cannot be fabricated. It must be genuine. The gluttony victim's consumption was real. Victor's neglect was real. The lust scene's forced transgression was real. Tracy's murder was real. Doe does not manufacture moral outrages. He selects them, frames them, and stages them. The realness of the injustice is what makes the emotional response to it irresistible. You cannot dismiss your anger by telling yourself the provocation was fake. It wasn't. It never is. Step 2, stage it as maximum spectacle. The real injustice in its ordinary form is not sufficient to break through the normalization Doe diagnoses. It is already happening quietly, invisibly, filed away as low priority by every institution that could be doing something about it. The transformation required is from invisible to spectacular, from the kind of thing you pass on the street without seeing to the kind of thing you cannot look away from. Doe's genius is his understanding that spectacle is not distortion, it is forced visibility. The crime scene version of Victor is more morally honest than the filed report version. The spectacle reveals what the administrative process concealed. Step 3. Deliver it to a mass audience. One person's encounter with injustice produces one person's moral response. Mass encounter with spectacularized injustice produces the social preconditions for collective wrath, which is qualitatively different from individual wrath, more powerful, more self-validating, more resistant to the Somerset voice asking for deliberation. The mass audience is not incidental to Doe's project. It is the project. He needs witnesses. He needs congregation. He needs the collective moral response that makes individual resistance to wrath feel not like wisdom, but like cowardice. Step 4. Amplify emotional response before deliberation can occur. This is the most technically precise step and the one that most directly indicts contemporary media architecture. The box works because it arrives after 2 hours of preparation. 2 hours during which your emotional response to injustice has been systematically primed and your capacity for deliberation has been systematically eroded. Somerset has been running desperately, trying to arrive before the emotional response overwhelms the deliberative one. He almost makes it. The gap between the box contains Tracy's head and Mills pulls the trigger is about 30 seconds. 30 seconds is not enough time to be Somerset. 30 seconds is exactly enough time to be Doe's proof. Step 5. Harvest wrath as theological validation. The final step is not punishment, not satisfaction, not survival. It is proof. Doe needs Mills to pull the trigger, not because Doe wants Mills dead or because the plan requires Mills's destruction. He needs it because the pulling of the trigger is the evidence for the argument, the validation of the thesis, the congregation completing the sermon by becoming the sermon's proof text. When Mills shoots, Doe has demonstrated empirically in real time before witnesses that his diagnosis of human moral capacity is correct. 5 steps. A real injustice, staged as spectacle, delivered to a mass audience, amplified before deliberation, harvested as validation. This is Doe's methodology, made explicit. Now open your phone. The removal of Somerset. The most critical structural feature of Doe's mechanism is step 4, the amplification of emotional response before deliberation can occur. And the reason it is the most critical feature is that it is the step that Somerset represents and the step that contemporary media architecture has systematically engineered out of existence. Somerset is deliberation made human. He is the library night. He is the walk to the crime scene, slowly thinking. He is the 25 years of accumulated context that allows a person to experience moral outrage and simultaneously hold the question, what does this outrage want from me? And is that what I should give it? Somerset is the pause, the breath, the gap between stimulus and response in which something resembling wisdom can operate. In 1995, when Se7en was released, Somerset was still structurally available. The media environment, for all its manipulation and spectacle, still had gaps, intervals between the event and the coverage, between the coverage and the audience's encounter with it, between the encounter and the social moment of collective response. News cycles had actual cycles. Public outrage had a production schedule. There was, built into the information infrastructure of the time, something like a Somerset delay, a period during which deliberation was not just possible but structurally necessary, because the box hadn't arrived yet, because the delivery system had built-in latency. That latency has been systematically removed. The optimization of social media platforms for engagement, the algorithmic process by which every major platform learned, through billions of data points, what kinds of content produce the strongest and most sustained emotional responses, has produced a media environment specifically architected to eliminate Somerset's function. The platforms don't want you to deliberate. Deliberation is low engagement. Deliberation produces nuanced responses that don't share well, don't generate reactions, don't feed the metric that the platform is optimizing for. The platform wants your immediate, unmediated, undeliberated emotional response, and it wants it within seconds, before the Somerset voice has had time to arrive, before the library night can happen, before you've had the chance to walk slowly to the crime scene, thinking about what you're about to see. The box now arrives before the drive to the desert has begun, before Somerset has had time to understand what is happening, before anyone has said, if you pull the trigger, he wins. The warning comes after, if it comes at all, buried in the ratio, posted by an account with 400 followers, while the post calling for wrath has 400,000 likes and is trending in 14 countries. This is not hyperbole. This is the operational description of every major public outrage cycle of the past decade, a real injustice, staged as maximum spectacle, delivered to a mass audience simultaneously, amplified before deliberation can occur, harvested by the platform, by the political operators who understand the harvest, by the ideological infrastructure that has learned to plant its seeds in the path of Doe's mechanism as validation for a pre-existing diagnosis of the world. Doe needed months to prepare his congregation. The platform prepares one in real time, continuously, as a business model. Fincher's career as extended thesis. Here is something that is never discussed in the critical literature on Se7en, because the critical literature on Se7en and the critical literature on Fincher's subsequent work are almost always kept in separate compartments. David Fincher has been making the same film for 30 years, not literally, not formally. The films look different, operate in different genres, engage different surface subjects. But the argument, the specific moral argument about the relationship between spectacle, mass audience, emotional manipulation, and the production of wrath runs through his filmography with a consistency that makes Se7en look less like a single work and more like a thesis statement for a career. Consider the sequence. The game, 1997, a man is subjected to an elaborate, perfectly engineered experience designed to produce a specific emotional and behavioral response in him. The engineers of the experience understand his psychology better than he does. They use real events, real fear, real loss. Nothing is fabricated to produce a transformation they have pre-designed. The man cannot distinguish the engineered experience from reality because the engineered experience is reality, appropriated and redirected. Replace game with sermon, and the film is Se7en's immediate follow-up. Fight Club, 1999, a charismatic ideological leader, Tyler Durden, identifies a real social injustice, the spiritual emptiness of consumer capitalism, the emasculation of the male identity under late modernity, stages it as spectacle and provocation, builds a mass congregation around the shared experience of righteous anger, and escalates toward a final act of wrath that his followers complete for him. The narrator pulls the trigger. Tyler wins. The ideological machinery that produced wrath does not care who physically enacts it. Sound familiar? Zodiac, 2007. A film entirely about what happens to people who devote themselves to chasing evil, how the obsession deforms them, how the proximity to the monster's logic begins to reshape the logic of the pursuer, how the inability to resolve the case, to close the loop, to get Doe to the desert, to make the ending legible, produces its own form of destruction. Zodiac is Se7en's aftermath film. It asks, what happens to the people who don't get the box? What happens when the sermon has no climax and the congregation stays assembled indefinitely inside the architecture of unresolved outrage? The Social Network, 2010, the construction of a platform, the actual technical and social infrastructure that would automate the delivery of spectacularized human experience to mass audiences, removing deliberation, optimizing for emotional response, and building the mechanism that would, within a decade, become the most efficient wrath production machine in human history. Fincher films this origin story not as triumph but as tragedy, and the tragedy is not personal, Zuckerberg's isolation, his lost friendship, but systemic. The thing being built is shown from the inside as a machine for human disconnection dressed as human connection. A machine that eliminates Somerset, Gone Girl 2014, the most explicit return to Se7en's territory. A woman engineers a spectacle, stages her own disappearance as a public moral drama, to produce a specific emotional response and a mass audience, to weaponize collective outrage as a tool for personal revenge. Amy Dunn is Doe with better media access. She understands with cold precision that in a media environment where spectacle produces instant mass moral consensus, anyone who controls the spectacle controls the verdict. She doesn't need a jury. She has Twitter. She has cable news. She has the infrastructure of collective wrath that Doe could only dream of in 1995. The argument running through all of these films is the same argument Se7en makes, that the engineering of moral outrage is the defining power operation of modern life, that the mechanism has been available for exploitation since at least the mid-1990s, and that the people who understand the mechanism, Doe, Tyler Durden, the Zodiac, Mark Zuckerberg, as Fincher imagines him, Amy Dunn, are always several steps ahead of the people trying to resist it, because resistance requires deliberation and the mechanism is specifically designed to prevent deliberation. Fincher has been making this argument across 30 years of films. Se7en was the thesis statement. We have been receiving the extended proof ever since. Why knowing doesn't help. And now the most uncomfortable argument this essay makes, the one that has been building since the opening pages and that must be stated plainly before we close. You have just read approximately 26,000 words arguing that Se7en is a film about the engineering of wrath, that Doe's mechanism is real and replicable and has been replicated at scale, that the film implicates its audience in the very sin it diagnoses, and that the only moral response available is Somerset's fragile, metronome-dependent, connection-grounded refusal to withdraw. This knowledge does not protect you. I want to be precise about this, because the consolation that most film analysis offers is the consolation of understanding. If you understand how the mechanism works, you can resist it. If you know the trick, the trick stops working. If you can name Doe's 5 steps, you can identify them when they're operating and choose differently. This is false. And Se7en knows it is false. The film is not a manual for resisting wrath. It is a demonstration that wrath resists resistance, that even the most forewarned, most sophisticated, most morally serious audience will, under sufficient provocation, complete Doe's plan. Think about Somerset. Somerset is the most prepared person in the film. He has 25 years of experience. He has read the notebooks. He has studied the theology. He understands Doe's framework better than anyone else in the story. He runs across the field. He says the words. He knows exactly what is happening and exactly what is at stake. And he fails, not because he wasn't good enough, not because he didn't try hard enough, because the mechanism, properly triggered, operates faster than human deliberation can respond to. Because the gap between the box contains Tracy's head, and the irreversible act is 30 seconds, and Somerset needed 31. You are not more prepared than Somerset. And the mechanism is now faster than it was in 1995. This is the conclusion the film arrives at, and that most analysis retreats from, because it is genuinely hopeless in a way that is difficult to sit with, that moral knowledge is insufficient against the kind of engineered wrath Doe represents. That understanding the trap does not mean you can avoid it, that the next time you encounter Doe's 5 steps, the real injustice, the spectacle, the mass delivery, the amplification, the harvest, your intellectual awareness of the mechanism will not prevent your emotional response from being exactly what the mechanism was designed to produce. The only thing that can interrupt the mechanism is not knowledge. It is what Somerset has, the specific face. The particular person, the irreducible, non-abstract claim of a known human being on your continued deliberation, the thread of connection that makes it impossible to treat the situation as purely categorical, purely theological, purely a matter of principle. And that thread, that is what the platform is most precisely and most successfully destroying. Not your knowledge, not your values, not your intentions, your connections, your specific relationships, your ability to be interrupted in your abstract moral outrage by the face of someone who was there and saw it differently, and whose particularity you cannot dismiss because you know their name. Doe's final victory was not Mills pulling the trigger. It was the world that made Mills's isolation and Somerset's near isolation the normal condition of modern life, and then built a delivery system for the box that operates at the scale of civilization. The final provocation. So here is where we end. Not with comfort, not with Somerset's modest affirmation, with the question the film has been asking since its opening credits, the question that 30 years of admiring analysis have answered incorrectly, the question whose correct answer is the most difficult thing this essay has tried to say. Did John Doe win? The answer is not yes or no. The answer is define winning. If winning means completing the immediate plan, 7 murders, 1 manufactured wrath, 1 detective destroyed, 1 theology proven, then yes, Doe won. Definitively, completely, without qualification. But Doe's ambition was never that small. His ambition was prophetic. His ambition was the ambition of a man who believed he was not just solving a problem, but revealing a truth, demonstrating, for any audience willing to look, the mechanism by which ordinary human moral architecture collapses under sufficient pressure. His ambition was to be correct in a way that would resonate beyond the desert field, beyond the case file, beyond the film itself. And that ambition has been vindicated on a scale he could not have imagined from a cramped apartment filled with notebooks in 1995. Not because evil triumphed, not because good people stopped caring, but because the mechanism he identified, the 5-step process for producing wrath from righteousness, turned out to be not a madman's eccentric methodology, but the most scalable psychological technology of the 21st century. The platforms didn't invent it, they just automated it and deployed it and optimized it and named it engagement. The answer to did Doe win is this: Doe was right. Whether he won depends on what you do next. And what you do next, whether you can hold the Somerset position, maintain the specific connections that interrupt abstract outrage, find your metronome in a world that wants you to throw it away, insist on the library night in an architecture designed to skip straight to the box, that is not a film question anymore. That is the question you carry out of this essay, out of every viewing of Se7en, back into the world that Doe diagnosed and that we have been proving correct in aggregate every day since. Somerset stayed. He set the metronome. He went back to work. He did not do this because it was sufficient. He did it because it was the only available refusal of the logic that said it wasn't. Go be Somerset. Not because it works, because the alternative is to be Doe's final argument. The proof that wrath always wins when the provocation is real enough, the spectacle is large enough, the amplification is fast enough. Go be Somerset. Set the metronome. Find the specific faces. Insist on the library night. The sermon is still running. You are still in the congregation. The only question left is whether you pull the trigger.